Hi guys, welcome back. Very glad to, it's like we're starting the school year now, right? Summer's over. Hopefully, you read this last night in the 2 hours that you had free or whatnot. But we're really glad to be.
I'll pick up this water.
My director over here.
Yeah.
We're really glad to be welcoming you guys back as we delve into this really short but sweet story. And everybody, I hope, has an opinion about it and will share liberally what they feel about this. And thank you very much, Robert, for being back
Sure.
here again and leading us with this. There's treats to stimulate the discussion, but please enjoy.
Thank you very much, Johanna. It's great to be back with Czech Book Club. The weather's getting more human, and here we have a very human tale. And I think because this is a book club and it's not a lecture, the kind of notes I've prepared are very limited, and they're in the spirit of possibilities. This is the word I've come up with, possibilities for things that we might talk about. And I will kind of mention maybe 6-8 possibilities, and then over to you, or over to all of us. And as the spirit moves you, maybe take up one or more of these prompts, or none of them, or some of your own, etc., etc. I think one of the real benefits of this edition, even though, and Alice and I were talking about this yesterday, we appreciate Edith Pargetter's translation. It is perhaps a little creaky. It's rather English, rather home counties, maybe doesn't quite capture Hrabal's tone. Maybe, I think the world is maybe ready for a new translation into English of this masterpiece. But as Joseph Szkewerecki's introduction makes clear, we're dealing here not with a twice-told tale, but a thrice-told tale. And this is a story that exists really in 3 different versions. And this is a story that rather obsessively, but also due to circumstances, Hrabal returned to again and again. So we know that this was a story, or also a novella, an even darker, rawer, more chaotic telling of the story way back in 1949. So first of all, it's interesting, the time gap, as Szkewerecki points out. It wasn't immediately after the war, even though it's set in the spring of 45. It wasn't immediately after the war that he wrote this story of the war. It was after the communist takeover in 48. So he writes it in 49. He reads it to his friends at one of these great underground soirees that I wish I'd been at in Prague in 1950. It's too raw. It's too intense. It doesn't fit the recipe and the formula for good old socialist realism. And that follows. You do know the formula of socialist realism, right? No? Yeah. Boy meets tractor. Yeah. Boy loses tractor. Boy wins tractor back again. So it's not quite that kind of rosy romance of collective agriculture. So far from that there was no way that it was so countercultural in the Stalinist 50s that it wasn't going to get published. And then we have this return and this braiding of various threads of the original novella into the rather polished and sophisticated literary performance of Closely Watched Trains, published in 1965. This is, according to the expert here, a more polished, perhaps a sweeter telling of the story, although there's still some very dark aspects to it. maybe a little bit softer, maybe a little bit more sentimental. Certainly, the sexual comedy is something that he emphasized in this very successful 1965 version. It also becomes more sophisticated as a text. He does these time shifts. He puts in other kind of modernist tricks. I do notice that, I mean, he was very aware, as were so many Czech writers, of the modernism that had transformed European literature in the 20th century. So that scene rather late on, when you have one kind of fireworks going on and another kind of fireworks going on, right? Both amorous and military fireworks happening at the same time. That reminded me, as an Irish writer, very much of a famous and infamous scene in Ulysses by James Joyce. It's one of the scenes that got Ulysses banned in this land of the free for the first 12 years of its life. So I think he's very aware of kind of literary sophistication. It's something that we've talked about with Hrabal before. You know, he's very streetwise. His language can be very demotic, very common, but he's also very culturally sophisticated. He's also very poetic at the same time. But so successful was this novella in 1965 that it almost immediately turned into this magnificent film by Jiří Menzel in 1966, which, talk about the kind of the wave of fresh Czech culture at the time, wins the Oscar for Best Foreign Film in 1967, and another sort of, you know, inflection point in the emerging Prague Spring. And I think also that really is the thrice of the telling of the tale, because Menzel and Hrabal worked very closely on the script for that movie. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe particularly those of you who are native Czech readers might be able to help us out with, is the translation, though earnest, doesn't seem quite to work all the time. I don't think it's as exuberantly Hrabal-esque as the Paul Wilson translation of I Served the King of England, which is a later translation. And I'm wondering if in the 1966 movie, which is so stylish, so funny, so droll, so crisp, so assured, if we're getting something closer to the tone of the novella in the original Czech of Closely Watched Trains. The other funny thing about the film is that it does restore the chronological order of the original, you know, pretty in-your-face, raw novella, The Legend of Cain. So it's a more linear telling of the tale. And what tale is it telling? I think it's a tale that is not only trying to cope with history, but also I think to a certain extent, and I think this kind of retrospectively shines a light on some little moments in the novella. I think there's a great nostalgia there for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not just the Czech Republic, but there seems to be a sense of lost grandeur in the uniforms, the music, the ceremony, the count and countess living on the hill, and the largesse they used to be able to, grant the townspeople and the workers down at the station. And of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was incredibly generous to Miloš's great-grandfather, who got this kind of endless pension for about 70 years, it seems. So you've had generation after generation of these people really benefiting from the system and benefiting from a rather liberal power structure. So I think there's a nostalgia there. Obviously, they're going through a much darker chapter of history with the Nazi occupation, and indeed the collaboration of people like that high official who comes to adjudicate the court case against the the dispatcher and his various entrepreneurial efforts. I think the book is very interested in the whole business of authority, who's in power, who should have power. You know, maybe if authority is a kind of justified power or a power that somebody deserves to have, who should be in charge? Do they have authority? And I think there's a great questioning of power and authority going on in the book. It's looking back at the good old days, maybe a nostalgic view of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Clearly, the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakian Republic itself has been betrayed. Even though the grandfather went out and tried to mesmerize those tanks, you know, clearly Czechoslovakia was stabbed in the back, and even now some of the luminaries within Czech society are collaborating with the Nazis. Is there a kind of subversion of the current power structure with the communists? Is it rendering all hierarchy absurd and questionable, right? I'm probably, if you're in the official Ministry of Culture, as Shkeverecki suggested at the beginning, you probably don't like this book because it's very irreverent when it comes to those who are in charge. And I think a word that occurred to me often when I was reading this was the word burlesque. It's not just satire, but I think here Hrabal is writing in the tradition of the burlesque, or whatever Middle European version of the burlesque exists. And the burlesque is a very specific kind of satire. It's the kind of satire that brings the low high and takes the high and brings them low, right? So you have this kind of absurdity of these provincial railwaymen considering themselves to be the blue aristocracy because we wear the uniform of the railway system. And so people who really have very little power have all the kind of paraphernalia and finery of great power. They look like generals. They look like highly decorated officials. And meanwhile, those who have great power who have real power and the power of life and death and the power of adjudication are made to look extremely base and ridiculous and grotesque. I think this is all part of the difficult meditation with history and recent history that Hrabal is doing in this book. And clearly, you know, with such a difficult subject as Czech history and the many crimes against Czechoslovakia that were committed, you know, as armies swept back and forth across the plains of Europe during these decades. I think Hrabal, in these various tellings of this tale and other stories of his, I think he's trying to figure out, how am I going to deal on a literary level with history? You know, one strategy is to always kind of take the point of view of a little person, the small person, the powerless person, the gauche and gawky person, as Miloš Herman is. Take a comic approach. Maybe this is one reason why it's so short. I mean, I think at best it can be called a short novel. I think of it really maybe as being a long, short story. First of all, the kind of narrative arc is very tight, isn't it? I mean, it's very, very carefully engineered, and there's a considerable economy of incident and episode. I think this is in spirit perhaps closer to a short story. I go back to a kind of absolutely classic definition of the modern short story given by my compatriot Frank O'Connor when he was teaching in the United States, and wrote a very influential little book on the short story called The Lonely Voice. The short story is the form without a hero. And I think that's something very, very close to Hrabal's vision of life, right? This is dealing with history and trying to meditate on history from the point of view of a lack of heroism. Because even Miloš's great act of heroism at the end of this very tight story, it's not exactly motivated by the purest political and moral ideals. It's all mixed up with his sexual confusion and his immaturity. And then his death is rather, undermotivated and a little bit random. He could have survived, but he doesn't. He's crushed by history. And one eerie moment for me in my reading of Closely Watched Trains was when the fireworks are happening finally for him with a lady. The fireworks on the horizon is actually the nightmare of the firebombing of Dresden in February 1945. And there's a realization that it's not just the Czech people, and it's not just the oppressed peoples of Europe who are suffering, but the German people are suffering too. And this to me was a startling intersection with our own American literature. Shkeverecki doesn't mention this at the beginning. He's very aware, living in Canada, of North American literature. But one book, one kind of anti-heroic, tragic-comic take, irreverent take on history and World War II that he doesn't mention, but he could have, is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is also short and brutal and has odd time shifts. And I couldn't help but remember the time many years ago when I met Kurt Vonnegut. I was a young, callow writer of 22, and my English friend Francis and I showed up to this Kurt Vonnegut reading, and we were there very early. And we went into the green room, and the only person there was Kurt Vonnegut. So it was really weird, and he was there with his little thimble of white wine, very tall, what I thought of as an elderly person at the time, very tall, very imposing. So we went over to talk to him. And he said, well, what are you guys doing? And we said, well, we're part of this graduate writing program, He's like, okay. And my friend Francis, being a far more honest and candid person than I was at the time, he said, here I am, myself and Cremins here, this Irish guy, we've started this graduate writing program, and we're learning a great deal about literature and craft and technique and all these sophisticated ways of telling a story. But he said, I'm 22, and I don't think I have a story to tell. And then there was a pause. I thought, this is a bit awkward, but Francis had just said really what I'm thinking. I was also 22. And Kurt Vonnegut looked at him and said, when I was 22, I survived the firebombing of Dresden. There was a beat, and he said, but I wasn't able to write about it properly until I was 45. And this is something that I've subsequently researched this because of that moment. And this is something famous in Vonnegut studies, the 5,000 pages. He wrote 5,000 pages trying to figure out, how do I process this moment where I was part of history? And I was this young, awkward, unheroic, guy, part of what he calls this children's crusade. And, what happened to Vonnegut is maybe on a parallel with what happened to Hrabal and the constant reiterations of this story until it wins an Academy Award. One thing Kurt Vonnegut did when he came back to the United States was he wrote science fiction novels for years. It's almost like he had to leave planet Earth and come back before he could get the right angle to treat the story. It's not just the story. It's not just what happens, but how you're going to tell the story. I always think of a story as having really two sides. One is what happens, and the other side is, well, how are you going to tell it? How are you going to treat the story? Tell the truth, but tell it slant. our Emily Dickinson said. So maybe this is the slant angle that finally Hrabal finds. Two other little kind of possibilities. Closely watched trains. I think the idea of watching in its various forms and its various modes is very important in this story. Who's watching? How do they watch? What do you think might be the aesthetic but also the moral import of that idea of watching? You know, it goes beyond just a closely watched train is just a term for a high security, SS train in 1945. Exactly. There's a new form of watching. And okay, this is a great moment to hand it over. Right, exactly. So watching, there's a kind of subversive maybe dimension to that. Maybe you don't want this book even being published in 1965 because it's a fraud issue, isn't it? The idea of being watched, yeah. A closely watched population, not just the trains, but the people. All right, I think this is a great moment to hand it over to you all and see who wants to take up what thread. Maybe say more about watching. What other kinds of watching are going on? Absolutely, there is a kind of voyeurism going on, which could be creepy, but I think it's comic because he's so immature. He's so kind of clueless. I think it doesn't even amount to being naive. He's just so innocent, and he seems to barely know about the facts of life. I mean, the menopause is news to him. When the station master's wife tries to tell him about this, like, what changed? What are you talking about? So definitely he's watching. He's watching in a kind of voyeuristic way.
I think it's actually an interesting paradox because he is portrayed sort of as a simpleton. However, the things that he observes are at times profound.
Yeah.
I mean, he's very observant, and it's obviously kind of a way for Hrabal to describe things, and he's very masterful about it. And so it isn't interesting that he uses this simple character to describe everything in detail. And so he's watching everything and understanding everything. This is a stupid example, but it just cracked me up how that head of the railway station, how he, whenever he got in a situation when he got angered or something, he would walk into the kitchen and start shouting.
Yeah.
And the character said, well, that was a great mental hygiene. That was a great outlet. What a great mental hygiene that a person had, and he dealt with life with it. But it was just that just cracked me up. But
when the tribunal is held, they can't convict the dispatcher of any kind of attack on the young lady, but he's found guilty of irreverence towards the German language, right? That it's the denigration of the German language
in the stamp.
In the stamps, Again, it's the subversion of the subversion of the official language, the serious language, the language of power. I don't think that Hrabal was aware of this, but round about this time in the 1960s, and he was still alive, there was a great Russian critic called Mikhail Bakhtin who had kind of remarkably survived the Stalinist purges, I think, by going into a kind of deep internal exile where he was kind of forgotten about for decades. But under the thaw, under Khrushchev, his ideas began to circulate a lot more. And he was a great reader of a lot of different types of literature, but Dostoevsky in particular. And and he's one of the few kind of critics who's so creative that he's influenced creative writers. That usually doesn't happen. Usually, literary critics are considered to be an irritation by creative writers. But this idea that Bakhtin kind of spotted in all sorts of literature, all sorts of culture, ancient and modern, which he called the spirit of the carnival, which is that literature, just like the medieval carnival, is all about the little people having a chance to speak truth to power and to pull power down. And the idea in particular with the carnival is it's that one day of the year where the world goes topsy-turvy and the high are brought low and the low are brought high. So it's, usually like the town drunk or somebody who is kind of elected to be the carnival king. And you can make fun and you can mock the king and queen on that day. And I think there's something very, very carnivalesque going on, that the high official language, the German of the stamps, is made to look ridiculous. There's an irreverence towards it. And I suppose there's an added edge here, because do you think the novella is ultimately sympathetic towards the Germans? Because when he's writing the first version of this, as a consequence of the war, millions of ethnic Germans are being encouraged to leave Czechoslovakia. I wonder how aware of that is, how aware he is that the Germans also, not the Nazis only, but ordinary Germans are also greatly suffering because of the regime.
Absolutely, and I have a biography on him, which I just got into a little bit, but he when he got
About to see.
oh, I'm sitting right here, but I'm sorry, but he was a very mediocre student, like in elementary school, Gymnasium, Realschule, but when he did finally manage to get to the university in Prague, he enrolled in a law school. But something happened, like at the age of 20, he just started devouring philosophy and history of art, and he must be a very brilliant person, and was, but he was very influenced by Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer apparently said that alle Liebe is Mitleid, all love is compassion, and I think you see it in all of his work. And that kind of really became his creed in life. And I do think the way he has the compassion for the other German dying with him, the way there's this scene when they drop off those 4 people that came from Dresden on the train and just deposit them, and they're shell-shocked. And then they see I can't believe they can see all the way the bombing in Dresden. I was going to look at the map, but they see this glow and they say, I think the rail master said, which was pretty funny, I guess that's what happened to people that started the war against the world, but they all have compassion. Yeah. I mean, and I think that the humanity just comes across in his book greatly. I mean, he's got the compassion to the animals. And I mean, the book is kind of full of compassion.
It is, and it's interesting that in the book, he actually goes and he climbs up, looks into those cattle cars, and he's looking directly at the animals and their suffering. Those horses were so white that they gave off light like a flowering bush of jasmine on a summer night. And that's probably something that Hrabal noticed in 1923. He stored it up for this moment. He's got this fund of images. He's got this archive of images that he could draw upon. And that's the kind of perfection and the accuracy. Yeah. And I mean, it's there on
Yeah.
as I said, on almost every page. I think another, going back to what you were talking about, several people were talking about over here about compassion. Another kind of aspect of close watching that I'd like to think about, and here I'm my current job is I'm doing research on a philosopher and novelist, British novelist called Iris Murdoch, and one of her key ideas, which came back very quickly to my mind when I was reading this, is the idea of attention. And it's not a completely original idea. She was very, very influenced by great French wartime philosopher and mystic Simone Weil. It emerges out of Simone Weil's philosophy. The idea of attention, particularly seeing as a kind of moral act. One of the most famous quotes from Iris Murdoch is that love, we talked about love for him being compassion, love is the very difficult realization that other people are real. When you pay attention, not just see and notice details, that's one, you can do that and still have a completely clinical and detached interaction with another human being. A doctor can walk into a room and go, I see you're presenting the symptoms of influenza or something, and not really see the person. But the kind of attention that results in a kind of interior acknowledgement that, oh my God, I'm not the only person in the world. I'm not the only creature suffering on planet Earth. I think that the watching, am I going too far here in thinking that that's another dimension of the watching that's in the title? Watching to the point of actually acknowledging the reality and the suffering of the other person, the other creature, no matter their nationality or their creed.
Actually, the title, the word watching, I think doesn't represent the true meaning of the irony and the superb Czech expression of ostřestrehované.
Oh yes, tell me about that, yeah.
Ostří means sharply or keenly.
Yeah.
And střehované, it doesn't mean closely. It means sharply, keenly. And střehované doesn't really mean watching.
It's like guarded.
It means guarded, monitored,
Yeah.
followed. It's like, and a train is a train, okay?
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you're not watching it. So the title is sort of an irony title because there's nothing very important about very closely monitoring trains, right? What's important is that it's a banal profession that we're expressing something else, the control of people, control of artistic protest. It's got more meaning that closely watched trains are expressing. And that's where I realized that I'm really privileged that I currently can read in 5 languages and understand the culture, because that doesn't come out from this translation. Not that I can do better, but if you understand the culture, that's what it means,
And I think Pargetter does make a kind of run at that, because there seems to be a kind of variation on the title when they're saying, oh, tomorrow the SS are bringing through one of their high surveillance trains that may be a little closer. Yeah. I wonder if he's doing something that I've heard many years ago, the American novelist Don DeLillo say was one of these strategies, that you have the language of power, you have the language of, you've got a technocratic language, like whatever the German compound phrase is for, high surveillance monitored military train. You have these phrases that are from one or another modern jargon, whether it's commercial, whether it's scientific, military, something like that. And DeLillo said, if you're lucky, sometimes you can take these phrases and you can rescue them. You can kind of redeem them. You can turn them around. And there's a couple of examples of that. A famous instance of this from DeLillo's work was he took the phrase airborne toxic event, which was corporate speak, and it was a corporate public relations euphemism for this mass casualty chemical leak that was killing all sorts of people, killing many people, and somehow take that and try to add and enrich it by suggesting, well, you know, back in the 1980s, television was kind of like an airborne toxic event. He wanted to call one of his most famous novels, DeLillo, which is about the airborne toxic event, is called White Noise, but he wanted to call it Panasonic, but the corporation wouldn't let him. But certainly there was that gesture that there was an attempt to take that kind of inhuman language and humanize it or rescue it.
Hrabal has apparently a knowledge of our building, and it was a combination of military and old-fashioned military. They were like where the officer was a royalty, and that combined with how this routine works, how a night shift works.
Yeah.
I wonder if he had somebody familiar or if he himself was somehow going to that, because it sounds so realistic.
He worked at the.
He worked on the train.
So
Okay.
he was, when he enrolled in the university in Prague, the protectorate closed. It was at the beginning of the war, and the protectorate closed all the universities, the Czech universities. And so he moved back to Nymburk, which is this small town on Elba, and was sort of, what's interesting about his life, he was from a pretty, upper class family, and they tried to, I think they propelled him to study, to go to Gimda and study. And it appears to me he had an ambition to be a poet and writer from very early age. And he he did finish the law, and he studied philosophy, but he consciously put himself in these working class situation, because he, like you say, you are 22 and you don't have a story to tell. He kind of wanted to experience the life meet these people. And but anyway, back to this, he actually worked, the universities were closed. He studied law, so he started working as some law clerk, quit, and then somehow started working at the railroad and worked there for probably 4 or 5 years. So he has had this experience himself. And he actually was picked up personally by a German train, like this character in the book. He was, and in the book there was sabotage, but it probably was there. And he was put up on a train like that and held at a gun. So he had that personal experience.
My goodness.
So he, another of his book, the Solitude, Too Loud of a Solitude. And that third job was, he was the packer of all the recycled paper, and he did that for several years too. And so he wrote a book. It's called, and he very much draws from that experience on that. He worked in a steelworks for 2 or 3 years. I don't know if I don't think he wrote anything about that, but I mean, so until, I would say between 46-ish and 62, he kind of went, then eventually he worked as a stagehand in a theater, and then in 62, he became a writer. In the early 60s until 68, there was this thought, and so he was able to publish actually number of these books. And so this was published in 65, so it was possible to publish that book, and he published until Prague. So yeah, and then after 69, his life got very difficult. He kept writing, so
Was he ever a waiter like the book?
No, I don't think he was a waiter. But he
I think
so
in somewhere I read that it was based on the story of his coworker from the paper recycling plant.
Hanja.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the story of the paper.
Yeah,
Because the guy was somehow pushed out of restaurant business to
okay,
work in paper recycling. That's
yes,
the story.
okay. And he was a pub person, and he just loved conversation with anyone. And some of the pub conversation, he could be just as enchanted at talking to some simple person, or they could be, discussing philosophy. And it sounds like he was probably drunk every day of his life. He consumed a large quantity of beer and other stuff.
Research. Yeah.
Research.
Well, tell us some of the stuff that you woke up at 10, this class. And did.
Well, so I started reading this biography of his, and his death is a mystery too. There is a wonderful article from the Aspen Institute, Central Europe, about his death. So if you want to look at it, he was old, 83, and his wife died, his brother died, his uncle died. All of the people that were his family were dead. He didn't have any children, and he in a hospital, and because he was prominent, they let him stay in a hospital for in Bulovka in the orthopedic station for the winter, because he had a hard time walking, and they just let him stay there. And I think the only way out of they told him kind of, you will have to eventually leave, and the only way for him to progress would be to this physical therapy hospital place. And he was telling everywhere, I am not going there. He just didn't have a desire to work on his walking or anything. So he fell out of the 5th floor building. That's his death. And it was reported. Well, it's very inconclusive, and I think this article in the Aspen Institute Central Europe does a beautiful job. Just kind of, we will never know.
Did he close the window? Like,
I don't know. You heard that. You heard that. Well, he probably did. But they said that he was feeding pigeons and fell out of the window. But
Polish pigeons, I hope. Yeah.
Polish pigeons. But where were we going with
At
this?
10 o'clock, and he was drunk. And
So he actually truly had this experience in his own life that he was working on the railway station and was picked up by this SS train, and they held a gun to him and they let him go. That was true. And then there was another incident that it's just so unbelievable. The whole book starts, did he jump or did he not? And it starts talking about the deaths he wrote about and all this, and how close he came to death in his own life. And the other point was when he drank, he was highly functional, but in law school, he was out late the night before. He was late for his seminar or class. And so he was sauntering into the university at 10 a.m. And as he is approaching, he's seeing all the SS people guiding out the other students. And I don't know what happened if they were, because they try to, they try to hit the intel. So it feels
the
like
fact that he was drunk and showed up at 10
showed
o'clock
up late
saved his
might
life.
have saved his life. So he had moments where, one thing that I loved, his uncle, Pepin, was sort of his muse and huge influence on him. And his uncle apparently, let's see, I wrote it. He came up with this saying that says, this life is beautiful. It's maddeningly beautiful. Not that it really is, but that's the way I choose to look at it. And Bohumil Hrabal put it on his tombstone, on his uncle's tombstone. And I think this his close associate and who wrote this biography, he claims that was his creed, that was Bohumil creeds, and you see it in his book, that just life is full of irony. It's crazy, right? And then you just have to choose how you look at it and how you deal with it or how you live it. And that's sort of what he writes about a lot.
Well, it's just like, you know, you have this war going on and the guy's, you know, preoccupied with, you know, losing his virginity and not even,
Yeah, the other guy is preoccupied with his pigeons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
I mean, that was also how we all are preoccupied in our little world with our little
Yeah.
things and don't really see the big picture.
but or you rather
Or you don't
choose,
care about
it.
or
You don't
not that
choose
you
it.
don't care, or you don't want to because it's too much,
But it's
or you
just
cannot do
everyday life.
anything about it.
Yeah.
But that's how he does a great job portraying that. Yeah.
There's a very, I think, delicate balance to be struck, particularly by prose writers, you know. And of course, it sounds like it was the making of Hrabal that he did have these experiences of Czech working class, gritty life, and that he didn't remain the kind of surrealist poet who went to a university. He always retained that kind of surrealist poetry, the talent for the accurate phrase and the kind of the pithy expression. But it was the making of him that he did kind of enter that gritty world. But it's a very, very delicate balance to be able to kind of absorb the real culture of your society and yet stay disciplined and sober enough to write it down accurately and with craft, because, you know, an Uncle Pepin absolutely needs the loyal nephew who's going to write all that down and craft it. Otherwise, the words of a Uncle Pepin disappear with the person. And I think Hrabal is thinking about this. I think this is a fairly self-conscious fiction. And of course, the way that he lets us know about thinking about the struggle to actually record this successfully and accurately is through comedy, because when they kind of convene the disciplinary board to deal with the transgressions of the dispatcher, and the young lady, Virginia, is giving her testimony, and she's going, well, he didn't do anything inappropriate after that. And then the station master in the pigeon besplattered secondary uniform is trying to write it all. Did not do anything inappropriate after that. The struggle to write it down, to capture it accurately in language, because, you know, somebody who, as a younger person growing up in a pub culture in Ireland, I did do a lot of research preparing for this evening back in the 1980s and 1990s. There's a lot of really talented artists and storytellers and writers in Dublin pubs and Prague pubs. And 95% of them never finish anything because they spend too much time in the pub. They are too fluent in their storytelling in the pub. It's the person who has the discipline to leave the pub before closing time and go home and write it down who becomes the successful literary artist. So it's that, it's that balance between being part of, absorbing that pub culture and that public culture, and yet having the discipline to also, step back and go to the writing studio. You have a wonderful photograph of his writing, amazing space where he did his writing.
It's on my laptop if anybody wants to see it afterwards.
And most of these kind of entertaining pub performers, I've known some people who are no longer with us who were very talented storytellers, had a real talent for language, and they never achieved anything because they stayed in the pub. You've got to commit yourself also to the discipline of writing it down and writing it down with craft. When y'all were talking a few minutes ago, another American kind of parallel popped into my mind, which is, I don't know if anybody's been in a creative writing program in recent years. There's a book, another kind of small book, which has become absolutely standard in American creative writing programs over the last 20 years or so. A little book this size called Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson. Dennis Johnson was somebody who really lived a life on the wild side for many years, but he sobered up and he survived all that. He became a very prolific and disciplined writer in his later years. I think he won the National Book Award. He had there's another very short book of his called Train Dreams, which was very, very successful. But he published in the 90s this book of short stories called Jesus' Son, named after a Velvet Underground lyric, which has been, hands down, the most influential book of American short stories in the last 30 years. The way that Hemingway in the 20s and Raymond Carver in the 80s was like the model of excellence for American writing workshops, which usually focus on short works like short stories. You know, you really cannot get an MFA in this country without reading Dennis Johnson. Jesus with an apostrophe at the end.
Jesus'
Dennis Johnson.
Jesus is what?
son.
Jesus' son. Not even Jesus, it's just Jesus' son.
Jesus.
Yeah. And they're mad stories. And they go in the most, Dennis Johnson, yeah. Also, a very short novel of his, kind of Hrabal-like, Train Dreams, highly recommended. It's only about 110 pages. Very, very, very different. You know, in his sobriety, his long sobriety, he wrote a great variety of different books. But Dennis Johnson himself was super surprised by what a cultural phenomenon this little book of short stories, Jesus' Son, became. And he said, you know, asked about it, he would say, now maybe he was being disingenuous, he said, oh, they're just bar stories. Just bar stories. They were my bar stories. Like Hrabal at the Golden Tiger was famous for his bar stories and listening to his bar stories. But, you know, writers tell lies and writers can be very cleverly deceptive. I think they are bar stories of such technical daring. They break all the typical rules of telling stories that I think he knew exactly what he was on about. So like Hrabal, I think, yeah, they're bar stories, but they're a lot more. They're very sophisticated bar stories. They have these kind of weird swerves, like some bar stories you may have heard in your time from less than, you know, designated driver narrators. So I think there's that going on. It's a very sophisticated form of public storytelling. It is interesting. There's an Irish writer who is a great admirer of Czech culture called John Banville. He's one of our kind of leading writers. And he wrote a little book called Prague Pictures. And my friend in Prague says Banville gets Prague completely wrong. But he started visiting Prague in the early 80s, so still during the communist time. He got on some kind of writers, you know, these delegates of writers go off to conferences. It's a great opportunity to travel. From about 1981 onwards, he was visiting Prague on a regular basis. And everybody was telling him, you got to try and meet Hrabal, go to the Golden Tiger. And he and his writing friends did, and Hrabal wasn't there. So I wonder if there was a little bit of a persona there.
No, he frequented many pubs. That was just one of 25.
Okay.
Yeah.
They should have done a pub crawl.
They should have done a pub crawl,
Yeah,
and maybe
yeah.
it would have. Yeah.
I have seen so much great literary talent perish in pubs that
Yeah.
this is why I'm slightly obsessive about this. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yes, I have like a hard time getting through the forward.
And
You read the book, and
Yeah.
then you go back and get forward, and it's like, that should have been.
I think Penguin Classics, unfortunately not the publisher here, has done a great thing. Almost always these days, when you open it and there's the critical introduction, they say first-time readers will probably prefer to read this afterwards because there are plot spoilers.
But I didn't even know enough about it to know there were lots of spoilers.
Yeah.
But I've said that to so many people, I said, the book was so easy to read.
But-
the graphics, you even told me you didn't read it. And I read it now, and just with you talking, I probably read it again just while we were here. It's like,
I didn't read that, funny enough, because Korensky, the author, he wrote the crime story.
this guy that wrote the practice.
Yeah. Like I was just listening to crime novels on the Czech Public Radio.
Skvoretsky.
How do you say it?
Skvoretsky.
Korensky.
Shigoretsky. Okay. I've been getting that wrong for about 30,
That's
35 years. I do agree with you, though, just that I reread the introduction just to prepare this morning.
Yeah.
It made a lot more sense.
Yeah.
But let me get one thing straight. He did write the
The Legend of Kay, or
Yeah.
yeah, and it
Version
was
1,
it was-
1949.
but he was singing legend. He said in 1950 he read this version of it at a gathering.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was never.
It was published.
It was published,
but
but
it was published
in 68,
Okay.
later.
But it was published in and then when was,
65. So it gets pretty tangled.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what, I mean, like I said, I'm still home.
So it was original, I didn't read the intro, I got,
Yeah, the origin.
but was it originally called The Legend of Cain?
The Legend of Cain. So that was, version 1 was actually the second published.
But it kind of makes sense. There was a lot more death, and whatever is described, the animals, there were about more people, and it was published. So, but it did say it came out only one time. It was never republished. I don't.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, but you know, maybe right after the war in '49, things were much more raw.
Yeah.
And
But it is interesting because the first, just to go with the American parallel, the first account that young Kurt Vonnegut ever wrote of the surviving the firebombing of Dresden was a letter to his parents in 1945. You know, and that's a much more factual description. So sometimes, you know, sometimes the more linear, the more straightforward, the more factual telling does not suffice to get, I think, towards the truth of the story. I think it's so much in the treatment. It's not just the what, but the how. I have, I don't know, Joanna, what do you think of the time? How much longer do you think we should sit in the magic circle here in Magic Prague? But I have an idea, which is the writing, despite the translation, is so great. And this really is an embarrassment of riches, but I think it would be good to maybe just to look at a particular page that maybe is a kind of microcosm of the whole novella. And I just want to get your reactions to this. I know why I picked this page, but I'm more interested in your reactions to this. So it's a riff. It's a run. I think it's one of the most brilliant riffs in the whole book.
what page now?
Starts at the very end of page 46. And it's a long paragraph. It's the whole of page 47. I think we've all got the same translation. Do we all have the same edition?
I think this is the only.
Yeah. I saw a British edition, but different pages, but it's the same English translator. First of all, Councillor Zednicek spread out his pocket map of Europe, so I'm at the top of 47, so that he could use it as an introduction and expound the military situation of the German armies. When he unfolded the map, holes appeared in it. This was because Councillor Zednicek carried this map in his pocket so persistently that he had worn it out at the folded corners. But every one of those holes in the map was as big as Switzerland. Zednicek favored us with his interpretation of the situation in the Carpathians, where von Mansfeld's Fifth Army was engaged, the army in which Zednicek's son Bretislav was also fighting. But on the map, the Fifth Army was still stuck fast in one of the worn-away holes. It was a week now since it had got into it, and it still hadn't managed to climb out of the kettle. So Zednicek's son was fighting away somewhere in that hole. Just like his father, Bretislav Zednicek didn't know the German language properly and had recommended himself to the Germans by excising the Czech accents from his names. Now, Councillor Zednicek went on lecturing and drawing on his little map of Europe in pencil circles, which in reality were as big as the Black Sea. And these circles represented the nooses which the German army was going to be drawing tight round the enemy any day now. Councillor Zednicek drew in pencil the line of advance of the German armies across Asia Minor into Africa, where he bottled up the British army groups inside one circle, and then he surged across Spain and took the American forces by the neck. And after that, the councillor moved on to deal with the situation in the Protectorate, now heading for total commitment, as was demonstrated by the provisions for simplifying education. Museums and exhibitions would be closed, many trains would be stopped, and sport would be indulged in only on Sundays. Well, what difference do you think that makes?
And then you go to the beginning of the next page.
All right.
I mean, you're like,
I've forgotten that, the juxtaposition. Yeah,
I remember reading this.
yeah.
And not so much for what you're pointing it out for, but the holes. But then when I turned it up, I remember going back.
You know, it's an old surrealist technique, juxtaposition, you know, and again, the high and the low coming together.
Yes.
What a wonderful kind of refutation of this kind of delusion of military glory, this highfalutin account that he gives. Yeah,
That no one cared about.
yeah.
Well, also, he was the collaborator, so they all
was,
had
yeah.
to endure the presentation, and so they got right to business. It was over.
Except it was the collaborator, but his son was fighting in the hole.
In
And
the
I think
hole.
That's like,
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
Czech way of expressing resistance without
yeah.
showing that you're against. And
There was also one specific ethnic aspect that this guy really renamed himself from Zednicek to Zednicek to make it sound German. And in
It
The
cannot-
hot shakes have been
they
taken away.
removed his
Yeah.
accent.
Yeah.
Like I would be with a stroke and C would be with a hook. And he removed it from his name to sound like a German.
And you couldn't pick more Czech name than
Yeah,
Zednicek,
exactly.
so
And
that's
How
the
interesting.
difference.
Yeah,
Břetislav,
yeah.
which
Yeah.
for me is difficult
Yeah.
to say. Břetislav.
And the inspectors, he calls him Hubička, which means a kiss.
Yes.
You know, the guy that did all this,
The dispatcher.
the
yeah.
dispatcher, yeah. And the name of that
it may
woman,
also be big mouth.
Big Mouth. That's true.
That's the Czech thing.
That's okay. And then the woman that Hrabal finally became man with, her last name was Svata, which means saint. Or, right?
Yes, yes.
I
Or
think
no, it was Svata Freya too, which means free. That's what.
isn't it perfect that the kind of culturally humiliated local collaborator, you know, toadying to the Germans, he's got the pocket version of the big military map. And that's one of the great ways of telling the official story, isn't it? Look at us sweeping across Europe, you know, and we'll even kind of tell you this fiction that when we're retreating and about to face complete collapse, this is just a very clever strategy to defeat the enemy at the gates of the city, right? The official story is being punctured. You know, there literally holes are being punctured through the official stories. And it's in those little kind of worn out corners of the map, right? It's in the worn out folds of the official story that fiction comes in. That's the chance for comedy. That's the chance for truth. That's where literature comes in. Once the official version, the official story no longer suffices. There's, you know, this goes right back to the, you know, the trauma of the First World War, which again, Czech and the Czech experience there. Writers saying that, you know, James Joyce, for example, saying, I'm afraid of all those big words which make us so unhappy. Glory, victory, honor, triumph. This is a triumphalist narrative that is being kind of made ridiculous by what's in it, and then what immediately follows it too. I think they do a good job with that in the movie with some of the kind of martial music they use in the soundtrack, which is, you know, makes things absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it's on Netflix and on
Now,
Apple TV.
you know, the Czech Center is going to show the movie when? Next Friday.
Conveniently, because we thought
It is, I mean, it is such a great, it's kind of the perfect storm, I think, of Czech talent in the, you know, that flowering of Czech culture during the thaw of the mid-60s. Not only Hrabal and Menzel writing the screenplay, but the technical excellence of the directors that were being educated at FAMU, right? The precision of it's in black and white, but it looks so fresh. It looks as if it was made yesterday, I have to say. Maybe I was watching a very good, or the restored print is out or something, but I was very happy with what I saw on Apple TV. It's so crisp, the composition, the angle, the lighting. I mean, it's not a movie, it's a film.
It's a
The
film.
craft is
Yeah.
is incredible. And of course, think of some of the other people who were involved in FAMU at the time. Milan Kundera was one of the lecturers there, so that he's part of that whole atmosphere. And Milos Forman, of course, is the other great director who kind of burst out of that FAMU circle at that time.
Agnieszka Holland, which is active until today.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
she was their classmate.
That's what an incredible generation. And I think you get a sense of kind of the excitement of this new liberation in the mid-60s from that film.
Yeah.
And on that high note, maybe we'll hand it back over to Johanna.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for this.
It
Robert.
was
We
my
appreciate
pleasure,
it.
really.
Uh,
Thank you. I'm wearing my cat socks to remind you all about the third episode.
So the last of the Hrabal books that we'll be reading is All My Cats. We're going to be discussing that on October 11th, which is a Saturday. It'll be again at 3 p.m. Seems to be a decent time for everybody. If you would like to purchase any books, we do have some for sale both downstairs and up here. And of course, we have the film that's coming up next week. And we've got a number of other events that are coming up. October is Czech Heritage Month in Texas, and we do it all the time here in this building, but we really ramp up a lot of what we've got going on. And we just opened up the third floor again. That's been closed for the summer as we redid our exhibits. So hopefully you all come back, and thank you very much for this lovely discussion.
Yeah, thank you for such a great turnout and such great engagement with the book today. It's really been so much
I
fun.
liked it.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
they can't keep me away.
So it's a shorter time period, but it's a small enough book. You can also read this in a weekend if you need
Yes.
to. So.
There you go.
And bring your cat paraphernalia. We'll make it
Great
a
day
whole
for the
thing.
cat people. Yeah.
I don't have any cat paraphernalia.
I don't either, but we'll figure it out. All right. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I love it.
All right.
Thank you.